The City of Light, it's a delight to have you with us today. We are reaching out to hundreds each week in the wonderful format of allowing people to experience this wonderful teaching going out through Facebook and social media and various different opportunities for people to connect with City of Light. We're delighted that so many are joining us, and we're seeing those numbers growing, and we're looking forward to reaching out to even more people. We're glad that you're with us today. Welcome. Well, let me tell you this. We want to invite you to an experience that maybe you don't often have within church. And that's an experience of thinking. That's right. Welcome to a thinking center. City of Light is a thinking church. And quite often when we think about spiritual communities or churches, religious environments, we're quite often encouraged maybe not to think, you don't need to think, just listen and absorb, take in whatever's being taught. Don't question, don't even contemplate, don't meditate, don't even worry about it, just receive it as it is presented. This is a thinking church where we encourage you to think for yourself. We have that old adage, you can give a man or a woman a fish, but teach them to fish for themselves is the greater experience. In this environment, we're offering you the opportunity to learn how to think. We're not telling you what to think, but learn how to experience that conscious journey of awakening to the presence of God in fresh new ways. We're inviting you to do some sacred work. That's right, sacred work. The sacred work of thinking. Now, a lot of people in this world today don't often think about thought or consciousness being sacred or being sacred work. We think about many other rituals within the church. We think about many other rituals within our religious communities, of whatever faith traditions we may be. We think of that as sacred work. But truly, the sacred work of thinking is essential for our life. It's the essential practice for us as growing and evolving people of great faith. Have you ever thought of the intentional work that we're called to do in mind, in thought? Our spiritual life really requires that we spend some time going within to that sacred space that's often referred to as the temple of the Lord. How many of you have ever heard that phrase, that you are the temple of the Lord? You're the dwelling place of the divine. You are the place where the kingdom of heaven is unfolding. For Jesus taught as our teacher and way shower that the kingdom of heaven is within. And so we go within in this intentional experience to create a deeper connection with the presence of God, a greater awareness, and in the process, a mastery of control of our thoughts that shape our lives. It's the sacred work of immersion, immersing ourselves in it, going deep within in this positive awareness. Wow, I love that thought. Positive awareness. Are you aware of all the positive things that are going on in the world? A lot of us are fully aware of all the negative things. Oh, and there's a lot of conversation. There's a lot of people pointing out this is what's wrong or not working right within our world today and within our communities. But how about being immersed in the positive awareness? A positive awareness that this is just a thought that fills your day-to-day experience, a consciousness that all things are working together for good. It's a baptism experience, you might say, a baptism in thought or a baptism in thinking, where we are going deep within and we're really living out and experiencing that passage of Scripture of great teaching that says, "Behold, the old has passed away, and the new is unfolding. The new has come. The new is discovered." Because it's only through the sacred thinking that we can release the old. By changing our thoughts and welcoming the new thought experience, welcoming a new way of thinking, a new opportunity, moving from negative to positive. That's the only way that we can really release this. And it's only in sacred thinking and in sacred contemplation that we're really able to welcome anything new unfolding in our lives. So it is, as we think of sacred work of thinking. Sacred, what does that mean? Meaning holy, meaning whole, W-H-O-L, holy or complete. This is our work in thought, to seek the whole, not just the part. Quite often in our journeys, we may just grasp little tidbits, but not the whole understanding. We may get a little bit of this or a little bit of that, and sometimes that makes people very dangerous. You know, there's those people who will pick and choose even scriptures out of the Bible and try to create their own theologies. There's a passage that said Judas went and hung himself. And another one says, go and do thou likewise. You can imagine how crazy we can be when we just have the parts and not the whole. And putting it all together, the completeness of an understanding. This completeness of understanding of who we are and what we're called to be and what we're called to do is so essential. That's why it requires some sacred thinking in our journey. We are using our mind to see and experience something more, our highest and our best. We're using it to be immersed in that we begin to unfold from that type of thinking, a life that we truly desire to see unfolding within us. We quote a passage of Scripture so often, but it's a favorite of mine. Let this mind be in you. And there are so many days when I'm thinking, oh, wait a minute, let me just echo that over and over again. Let the mind that was in Jesus, the way of thinking that was in Jesus, the thought process, the consciousness, let this mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. Let us do the sacred work of being in the consciousness and the same thinking of Jesus. If we're going to be a follower, we must think as that person or that spirit, that divine inspiration that is leading and guiding us, that we're following behind. Have we thought about Jesus and what his consciousness demonstrated? Because really, as we look across our world today, we're kind of confused about what this teaching of Jesus really was. Today's Christian communities have moved away from the mind of Jesus and moved into so many other trains of thought. They're not in the consciousness, not in the thinking, not in the teaching and the awareness of that Jesus brought forth. This is our challenge where we've gotten so busy in so many churches and religious communities worshiping Jesus. And by the way, Jesus never asked to be worshiped. Jesus never once said, worship me. Present on earth with disciples, he could have said, bow down and worship me now, sing praises to me. Yet we've got churches who build so much their theology on a worship of Jesus who never asked for it. But what he did ask was to follow him. And yet we struggle with the journey of following the very teaching. And so maybe we need to have a little refresher of what our consciousness and what our thinking and what the sacred art of thought needs to focus on. For we find in the teaching of Jesus a teaching of love for all, inclusion. Yet we find people speaking of exclusionary ways within churches and division happening within denominations over issues of inclusion and who's welcome and who's not. Loving the God with all your heart and your mind, your thought process, not just loving God with your words and loving God in ways of just expression of songs or in a sanctuary gathering, but it's loving with your mind in your very thought process in such a way that you love your neighbor in the same way that you think or care about yourself. And when you think about your survival, we're called to think about someone else's survival in the same way. When we think about what works for me, we have to think about how does that work for someone else? And though they may be different or diverse or have different needs, our thinking is they are our neighbor and we're to love them in the same way that we love ourselves and that we love God. We're called to really put a care and compassion into action for the poor, the widows, and those who are unable to help themselves. And that compassion calling is how we create a world that really works for everyone and not just a few. That we're really demonstrating a compassionate heart that says, how do we create this world that it works for me, but it's not working for you? How do we make it create this environment where that there's this harmony and sense of oneness within us? For Jesus' teachings were so powerful on judge not, lest ye be judged. A judgment-free zone is really what we're called to live in as we are followers of Jesus, not casting judgment on anyone or anyone's particular pathway, and forgiving and forgiving and forgiving again. For the daily call of a follower of that teaching would be one who is exercising the power of forgiveness on a regular basis, daily forgiving and allowing that power of releasing of any hurt, wound, or resentments. Doing unto others as you'd have them do unto you, being so essential in the teachings of Jesus. And thinking in a way that we understand that God is ever present and God is seeking you, as we find the very story of the prodigal son framing the theology or the mind of Jesus. That the father, even though the prodigal son had left and gone off on his own, choosing his own to spend all of his inheritance, comes back to find the father waiting with open arms, no judgment, no punishment, no shame on you, but celebration, welcome home. That's the kind of love that God is there, ever present, offering. There's a calling that Jesus speaks about. We're called to work out our own salvation, not to work out someone else's. And yet we find too many communities in today's world that have forgotten that consciousness and are instead thinking, my job is to work out your salvation and tell you how you need to live your life, versus working on our own salvation and how important that is. And to be responsible for our own journey, for you have the power to create your own world. Not saying someone else needs to be responsible, someone else needs to do this for me, or the pastor needs to create my spiritual life for me. We are called to create our own. This is the very calling of the teaching of Jesus, that we are all sons of God and all sons of man, and that he came as our example and not our great exception. Wow. We look at all of this, and it's summed up in Jesus' desire for that we may also be one with the divine presence as he was one with the divine presence. And that we, in that understanding, understand that all that is of God is mine. All that is of God is available to each and every one of us. From this perspective, then, we can begin our thinking progress, and our sacred work is that to be immersed in this kind of daily sacred contemplation, a consciousness that is so deep and rich in its power of love, a baptism. Oh, wow. I had years in seminary to study baptism, We would have classes, practical classes for pastors that, we had the experience of baptizing other students in the experience as well. And in that context, it was a baptism of total immersion, teaching people, you got to bring that body all the way down, you hold it like this, and then you lower the person back into the waters and make sure they've completely immersed in, and then bringing them back up. And, it was all about that, making sure that waters covered everything. One of the questions I really had is, a lot of people went through a baptism experience, but their lives weren't changed. The water didn't change their thinking. The water didn't change their actions. Oh, maybe maybe there was not enough water. I lived on the edges of the Sahara Desert in northern Kenya and worked with the Turkana tribe. And working with that tribe, there were those who were coming into that faith tradition and they were wanting to be baptized. And we were there in a small oasis where there was barely enough water to serve the camels, for these were nomadic camel herders coming through the desert. Certainly not enough for a bath, or barely enough to even wash your face with. And would there be enough water to totally immerse in? But you see, it's not about the amount of water. It's not about how big the tank is, or what lake or river you're baptized in, or how many gallons of water it is, because it's not the water that washes. It's symbolic of an immersion, of a washing and a cleansing that happens within our hearts and our lives, that's deep within. It's a washing away in sacred thinking. Physical waters of baptism can't wash away that adversarial thinking. We may think waters and baths, and if that were the case, we'd all be wonderful Christians as we showered this morning. We'd all be just released, and just all fear and anxiety and all stress and separation and lack would be all gone because the water poured over us. But it's not the water. I don't know about you, but I grew up in a world where, mothers would say, if you say those naughty words, I'm going to wash your mouth out with soap. Oh, yes. Mothers would grab that bar of soap and a washcloth and wash your tongue out if you swore, if you used some sort of words that were inappropriate, some curse words out. And isn't it funny? Because this soap and water didn't really change anything. If there was any change at all, it was the trauma of that nasty soap and the mother's displeasure that changed our thinking. You know, it wasn't the soap, it wasn't the water, it wasn't the washcloth, it wasn't the scrubbing of the tongue or the inside of the mouth, it wasn't any of those things. It was the experience that created a change of thought. I will not say these words again. So for us to evolve spiritually, we must be continually engaged in this process. It's an immersion. It's a baptism that happens within our lives where we are not immersed in anything physical. It's not water or soap that cleanses us. It's the change of thought. It's the sacred thinking that we do that's so intentional. City of Light, this is a church that invites you to think, to be aware, to be awake, to be conscious of the greater things of God. We're constantly inviting you to this journey that you become a thinking congregation that says, I've spent some time in great thought. I've spent some time fully being conscious of the divine presence of God. I've spent some time where I am really open up to this greater truth that is divinely unfolded for me around us today. We find a lot of societies and lots of groups that are trying to ban books. We don't want this book out or that book going out. We're telling teachers not to say certain things or teach history. We're telling them not to say gay in schools, which is kind of interesting, as well as instead of inviting them to think through each one of these things, to learn through the experience versus to ban the thinking process. We want to engage in the thinking process and how important that is essential. It's sacred work that we think, that we expand, that we learn, that we ask questions. For this is a community that is all about that. Many people ask me, what brought you to this place? Having grown up in a fundamentalist Christian church as a preacher's kid, what brought you to this place of being someone who has sharing a teaching of new thought and consciousness and an understanding of spirituality that's much broader than just one particular pathway? What brought you to that place? Well, it's when I began to ask my first question. You know, as a preacher's kid, you didn't ask questions. Your dad was the pastor. You know, hush up, Dad's right. Dad's right at home, Dad's right at church. You don't even ask a question in either context or either place. But when it became to this place of me asking questions of simply saying, you know, if God is love, when does this love stop? That people talk about that God no longer loves or wants or is there for you and instead punishes and desires you to burn eternally in hell. I began to ask this question, if God so loved the world, why would God rapture only those of a particular religious group and take only a select group and leave everybody else behind? I thought God loved the entire world. How does that make sense? If this same Jesus was to come in the disciples' generation that is spoken of, then why are we looking for him now? And why are people looking for him to come in the clouds? And if God so loved the world, why does God not love the LGBTQ community? You see, it was those series of questions that began to crack open, and the light began to shine in as I began to inquire and search and seek for more. Those first questions opened up the walls, and I became a seeker. You see how essential it is as we understand the sacred work of thinking is that of being a seeker. For unless we become one who asks the questions and seeks to know more, we become stagnant in our spiritual growth, and we are not evolving and we're not changing. You know, I went to church that didn't really think about what it sang, singing hymns about, I'm so unworthy, thinking of things, I'm a wretch, thinking of things that I am unworthy of God's love and all this kind of thing without even thinking or questioning, and then going home and wondering why I feel so empty and unworthy. We listened to the pastor's words, but we didn't ask questions. And oh, my Lord, I would love it if on Sunday morning we could just shut the cameras off and ask questions. Let's do that. Because that's what it's all about, seeking and searching and saying, how do we find that deeper understanding of truth within our lives? You know, in the ancient ritual of baptism found in the Jewish practice, it was an experience that was in deep waters, moving waters that were rushing away in powerful ways within the context of baptism. I've had the opportunity of being baptized in the River Jordan. Unfortunately, it's become very much a tourist attraction, and it's a tourist event, something like going to Disneyland, you know. You get in on the bus, and ladies and gentlemen, please move on to the baptism experience, and you go through the maze, and you go through the line, and you get your $29.95, you pay your price, and you get your robe, and you change your clothes, and you go through the maze of chain link pathway leading into the waters, and finally it's your turn, and it's either some pastor or some religious leader that is there that baptizes you, and you have that experience that you said, okay, it was like a tourist attraction. It's like, hey, I saw the Eiffel Tower. I was baptized in the River Jordan. And sometimes it just becomes so moved to a place where it's just an attraction, a thing to do, and we don't understand the meaning of this immersion within our lives, just as we don't think about being immersed deep within the thought processes that are there for us. To be so immersed in a way that is, I am living a spiritual life of intentional thinking. This physical world is filled with so much information and misinformation that is designed to exhaust our critical thinking and to move us away from truth. Well, if it's on the internet, it's got to be true. How many of you have seen Bigfoot? It's on the internet. Yeah. And how about the rumors about celebrities and stars? And didn't Betty White die about 6 years ago? And all this kind of stuff that people put out on the internet. And you think, well, if it's on the internet, it's got to be true. You see, we live in a world of a lot of misinformation, that we're bombarded with the misinformation that enables us to just become people who've lost the fine art of critical thinking, of moving away from that ability to seek out and search, and we just take everything at its face value within our life. And our sacred work is that of deep, intentional thought process that says, I want to know why. I want to know how. I want to understand this. I want to embrace this fully because I want a spiritual life that works. It works when you understand it. Faith is so powerful. We preach about it constantly, and how when we understand it, we ask the questions about how does this work within our life, and how does it bring about the miraculous unfolding within us. This is the crucial thing within our life. When we come to that level of the sacred work of thinking. Oh, how wonderful it is to have embraced in thought that you're so immersed in it that no matter what crisis comes your way, you're prepared and ready for it. Now, as a pastor, I receive phone calls from a lot of people who, well, they haven't thought much about their spiritual life, but suddenly they're in panic. Suddenly there's a crisis in their life. Suddenly they need prayers for healing. Suddenly they're facing a critical surgery. Suddenly there's this crisis at work. And they're saying, please pray for me and all this kind of stuff. And I want to say, well, where is the journey of our individual life that you're already ready for this experience? That when a challenge comes, you've already embraced the sacred work of thinking, and you're already ready for that challenge. You're prepared. Daniel was one who prayed 3 times a day. Opening up the windows of heaven is a simple metaphor, but it describes for him his action of opening up to the higher consciousness and allowing that higher consciousness to unfold within his life, and how important that was. He did it 3 times a day, engaged in critical thinking. And in that process of critical thinking, I'm going to have to sit down.